All right. Hello, everybody. This is going to be a long and coming review of Robert Caro's The Power Broker. This proved to be an excellent and interesting book, and I think that a lot of you are going to find this be a worthwhile book to look at. So, this is a book I wasn't familiar with. I didn't have this book for years. I hadn't been hearing about it. A book I don't think I'd ever heard of. I read Caro's other book, and he really only has two books. Caro was a news reporter, I think, for Newsweek for a while. And then he wrote this, and he wrote and is writing it looks like it's going to be a 5-volume biography of LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, 4 of which volumes are done. And that's it. And he basically only writes masterpieces. So I was reading the LBJ book. That's, I think, a more famous book because LBJ is a more famous character, if you're like me. I like to consider myself pretty well read and pretty knowledgeable about U.S. history, and yet I had no idea who Robert Moses was. And it was through reading Lyndon Johnson, the Years of Lyndon Johnson by Caro, which I've done a review on that, and I think that's an excellent book. That book is more interesting in the sense that it covers national politics, and it covers a lot of things that people might relate to that they may not with this, because this is more focused on New York City. But I was looking up to find the audio version of the Years of Lyndon Johnson, and this book kept coming up because it's the only other book by Caro. And I remember thinking, I don't want to read about some New York City bureaucrat. Why would that be, a topic of worthy study, something to spend my time on? But the LBJ book it's the best biography that I'd ever read. And by the way, that's not only my take. That book has won many rewards. It's inspired a lot of people. Among other things, it's inspired shows like House of Cards, which is largely inspired by that work. So it became something after I finished LBJ's book, and I was like, man, I want to read more of this Robert Caro, and he only had this one other book. I believe it clocks in at just over 1,300 pages. So compared to the Years of Lyndon Johnson, it's not even a third the length, but it's still a hefty book. And so I gave it a listen. And I think that great book, great history, and great analysis of the way power is wielded in the United States, and specifically in the city of New York. And I think that libertarians would have a lot to gain from this, even though Caro is himself definitely not a libertarian and is an apologist basically for a New Deal type ideology. So the book is basically, in part, it's biography, and there's a lot of biography in there. Where his family was from, where he was from, how he grew up, and then his career. But then it becomes an analysis on political power. And so let me scroll here. So there's a picture. This is Robert Moses here next to his book. This is Robert Caro, the author of the book. He's now 85 apparently, or maybe 80. Yep, still 85. And just phenomenal. These are peerless books in terms of biography and the amount of research he does, and it's evident in the book. I mean, he cites his own research constantly, and he's widely applauded for this. And you definitely see it on the page, and you get the impression when you read the book. So, unlike LBJ's book, though, this book is finished, so you can actually read the whole thing. So, So this isn't really readable. This is from the Wikipedia page. Let me just pull this up here. So this is the origins. So as a reporter for Newsday in the early 1960s, Caro wrote a long series of why the proposed bridge across Long Island Sound from Rye to Oyster Bay, championed by Robert Moses, would have been inadvisable. It would have required piers so large as to disrupt tidal flows in the Sound, among other problems. Caro believed that his work had influenced even the state's powerful governor, Nelson Rockefeller, to reconsider the idea, until he saw the State's Assembly's vote overwhelmingly to pass a preliminary measure for the bridge. Okay, and this sentence right here is very important for him writing this book and for the LBJ book. That was one of the transformational moments of my life, Caro said years later. It led him to think about Moses for the first time. I got in the car and drove home to Long Island and kept thinking to myself, everything you've been doing is baloney. You've been writing under the belief that power in a democracy comes from the ballot box. But here's a guy who has never been elected to anything, who has enough power to turn the entire state around. You don't have the slightest idea how he got it. So here, that's all this is here. I took a picture and it's too small to really see there. But you can read the Wikipedia article on this and see it right there. So let's go into, so I just want to cover the book a little bit before I kind of go into why this is important for libertarians. So Robert Moses is kind of an interesting historical artifact. So he is Jewish. His mother's Jewish, although I guess later he converted to Christianity. But they're from an earlier wave of Jewish immigration. There were multiple waves of Jewish immigration. So most of the Jewish people in the United States can trace their origins to immigrating in the late 19th and early 20th century from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from Poland. His family were German Jews. Believe they were Bavarian. There were obviously restrictions against Jews in Bavaria at that time. There was nothing like a Holocaust going on, no pogroms. But yeah, pretty restricted. His family moved and they ended up in Connecticut. And his father inherited / became wealthy, not incredibly wealthy, not top, absolute robber baron wealthy, but, wealthy enough that they could have a comfortable life. But his father was not that. The money came from him, but the influence really came from his mother. So his mother was a secular Jew, very secular Jew. She's one of this movement of Reform Judaism. And I don't want to say that she was actually in the Reformed Church, but there were a lot of Jews in the late 19th century, around the time when Zionism was starting to be formulated, that were saying, what should we do? And some Jews were saying we should abandon our particular practices. Stop keeping kosher, stop Sabbath keeping, stop teaching Hebrew, stop going to synagogue. And I've learned this from other studies. There are a lot of things that Reformed Jews were willing to part with. The one that they were least willing to part with, the most quintessential Jewish trait that was the most controversial in terms of abolishing, was circumcision. And yet, as the book points out, by implication once and explicitly later, she insisted that her son, and this is Robert Moses back here, not be circumcised. It's a point that he alludes to a couple times. So this is apparently an important trait. And I think it is because he really did seem to reject the idea that he was Jewish. He knew he was, but he just didn't care. And his mother that really seemed to come from his mother. That they had, obviously they were Jewish and they had ideas that probably could be traced to that, but she rejected, and his father assented to him and his brother not being circumcised. They never went to temple. They were not bar mitzvahed, anything like that. So they grew up basically a well-to-do family. When he was pretty young, they sold their property and their businesses in Connecticut and moved into a nice part of Manhattan. They weren't, again, fabulously wealthy. These weren't robber barons. These weren't like the Guggenheims or the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds or anything like that. But yes, lower upper class, and he went to Yale. And this is a picture of him. He graduated from Yale in 1909, and he was on the swim team and loved swimming for the rest of his life. He continued to swim until his death, and I think he died when he was 91, 92. And after he went to Yale, he went to Oxford. And without going into too much of the biography, he starts off as an incredibly reform-minded person. And this then comes from his family. You can see this pretty clearly from his mother and his grandmother. He looks at, what can public policy do to help people? Now, they had a certain paternalism. They talk about this with his mother. She did charity for the new wave of immigrants. So if you ever heard in the turn of the century, you started to get a big wave of Eastern European Jews, and the German Jews who already lived in the United States kind of did not, they looked down on them to a large extent. So if you ever heard the derogatory term kike, kike was a term that German Jews used to apply to Eastern European Jews because so many of them have a last name that ends in a key, Sikorsky, whatever, these Slavic key names. So they started calling them kikes. And their brand of philanthropy, which I think wasn't unique to them, is unique to a lot of people who are philanthropists, was, look, you're poor. We're going to help you because we feel we have an obligation, but also we're going to tell you this is what you need. This is how you need to act. You're going to take our charity the way we like it on our terms and be lectured to. And his mother was extremely opinionated, not just about charity, but about everything. And it's definitely a trait that he adopted from hers. And ran in the family too. His grandmother was that way as well. So he was very reform minded. And after he finished at Oxford, he came back to the United States and got involved in reform circles in New York City and basically launched a crusade for civil service reform. So at the time, for many decades, New York City government was largely controlled, sometimes completely controlled, by something called Tammany Hall. I'm sure most of you have heard of that. It was basically an Irish run primarily political machine, kind of the quintessential political machine. It was very corrupt. It was based on the spoil system. So you support us, then when we get in government, we will then use the taxes in government to divvy out favors, jobs, contracts, whatever it may be. Before the turn of the century, there was a shift in the corruption. So originally it was like just flat out graft, and there became this refined form of quote unquote legal corruption. Well, no, it's not graft, but your cousin's firm is getting a contract from the city to build whatever sewer lines or utilities, and maybe we'll overpay or whatnot, but then your company will become wealthy. But it's not your company; it's your stepbrother's company, and you're just a lawyer transferring legal fees. But the end of the line is you get super wealthy off of the taxpayer, but there's just no obvious paper trail. And he kind of was crusading against that and worked for the idea that they have like a standard civil service exam, that you had to be qualified to do your job, that you needed to pass certain tests, that there'd be pay scales that would be based on objective criteria, and the net result would be most people would lose a larger amount of their pay because they were basically not worth what they were paying. And he worked with this for years and years and years through various reform organizations. In the process of doing this, he gained a lot of credibility with reformers in the city, and there's always been a large reformer element in New York City to this day. And these programs came to nothing. They were thwarted by Tammany Hall, and he had something of an epiphany along the lines of, it doesn't matter what my ideas are or how good they are. If I don't have power, I can't enact them. And he, very similar to LBJ and Caro's other book, found a way to get power, and he had more than one way of doing it, but his initial bit of power came from another man, a powerful man who gave him power. And that powerful man is this guy. If you don't know who this is, maybe you've heard the name before if you don't necessarily recognize the face. This is Al Smith. So Al Smith was the governor of New York in the 20s. He ran for president in 28 and lost to Hoover. He was Catholic, Irish Catholic. He was born in New York City. Grew up swimming in the East River full of trash and garbage, and he became a Tammany man. He worked for Tammany Hall as a runner, and eventually they gave him a position in the State House, which he used, but then he actually became very adept at state politics, learning the laws, taking time to read the bills, go to the library, and so he became, self-taught in this. He's very famous as a kind of prototypical FDR figure. FDR followed him as a Republican governor of New York. Being a Catholic from New York City, there's this dichotomy in New York State where upstate New York is much more conservative and much more Protestant, and they don't really like each other, the two sides. This is still true today. I have friends from upstate New York who hate New York City and vice versa. And so for him to kind of have power in the state, they needed an upstate WASP, and that upstate WASP primarily, not exclusively, but primarily was a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, obviously not Catholic and obviously not Irish. So most of the progressive programs that FDR is famous for at a national level were instituted earlier in New York State by this guy, Al Smith. Now, what does Al Smith have to do with Robert Moses, an uncircumcised Jew reformer? L. Smith had a political advisor, this immigrant woman named Belle Moskowitz, very, very progressive minded, and yet also very pragmatic. She didn't care about what you wanted to do, she cared about what you could do. And she knew who Robert Moses was and brought him in some kind of minor position in the Al Smith administration. And eventually, Moses was able to not only ingratiate himself to Al Smith, not in the most sycophantic way that LBJ did with so many figures, but by being really skilled. And he became kind of like an advisor. And there's quotes in the book of him writing people and saying, wow, Al Smith listens to me. And in this period, he became himself very familiar with legal rules, law writing, the legislative process in the state. Something he knew about anyway. He was highly educated and had some experience there, but this is where he really got good at it. And they ended up becoming best friends for life, basically, until Smith's death. This seems to be the only person that Moses ever really, really respected. And I'll juxtapose him with LBJ here. I don't think LBJ really respected anybody. But Moses did, at least this guy. He did not respect Nelson Rockefeller. He did not respect FDR. In fact, he hated FDR, but he lionized and adored Al Smith. And at some point in Al Smith's governorship, he went to Robert Moses and said, you've done a good job. You're obviously competent. You know the law. Even though Smith wasn't a lawyer. Sorry, Smith. Moses wasn't a lawyer. And he said, if you want something, this is the whole thing about Tammany. It's a spoils system. If you want something, let me know. And Moses actually did not have a thing at first, but he waited until he found something that he wanted. And what he wanted eventually was to become the commissioner of the Long Island Parks Association. And one of the things, reformers had lots of things that they were, cared about, whether it was schools, was it mass transit, whether it was hospitals, tuberculosis beds, pollution, many, many topics, right? And one of the things that they were really concerned about were parks. So the parks system in the United States had started before this period in the late 19th century. The thing about the parks is the philosophy was, and I'm not saying this philosophy is wrong or endorsing the philosophy of the reformers, that parks were for preservation, right? They weren't for recreation. You create a big piece of land and you just stop development there and it becomes like a rustic wilderness. And if people want to go there, they can, but you're not going to build campgrounds. You're not going to build amusement parks. You're not going to build facilities. It's just going to be this big wild area. And there were lots of the early late 19th century park reformers wanted that. But there were other reformers, and Moses kind of became their champion at this time to say, well, what's the point of that? And we have all these people. You have this burgeoning metropolis in New York City, and you have all these inner city people who have never seen a beach, never seen a hill, never seen a glade or a shady hill, or walked on grass or whatever else. And yes, there was Central Park. Central Park goes back earlier, but Central Park is not very wild. And so there is this, we need to have parks that are accessible to the masses, or at least some of the masses, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And he decided that the place to do that was Long Island. So Long Island is this, if you're not too familiar with the geography, is about 110 mile long, 12 mile wide, roughly, island that comes right up to New York City. The westernmost tip of Long Island is part of New York City. Queens and the Brooklyn are in Long Island, and then it extends, and most of the island was farmland and parkland, but the parks tended to be small parks, and they tended to be owned by local municipalities that did not allow people who didn't live in those cities to visit. So you had these millions of people literally in New York City, and then all this land that was not available to them. And through his park position, now here's the interesting thing, Al Smith let him kind of write the law there. He wrote himself a law, and he started to build himself a legislative power here, because the position that he was granted through the law that he had written gave him a 6-year term, and he could not be fired except by a trial of some type. So the governor could not just say, I'm going to replace you with somebody I know. They had to have a specific reason. And it gave him enormous powers of confiscation of land, something that had been, private property is sacred. It's very hard to do. And There was also something, I think that Moses seems really to genuinely have believed in parks for people, but there was something else too. Um, Al Smith has a quote where to be on the side of parks is to be on the side of the angels. People just have this view that parks are good. Parks are a wonderful thing. And so if you're doing something for parks, it's good. So it doesn't matter if you're evicting people by the thousands. It doesn't matter if you're tearing up farms. It doesn't matter what you're doing because you're building parks and parks are good. And so you have, whereas if you were doing it to build a railroad or to build a bank or to build an arsenal or something like that, people would say, hey, whoa, cost benefit analysis, this is kind of, but parks, everybody loves parks. Who could be against parks? And he used that power. So this is the West Bathhouse pool at Jones Beach. So he built these very large beach facilities at Jones Beach, which is on western Long Island, not far from New York City. I think this picture here does it a little bit more justice on the scale. So here's the beach. I don't know if you can see it, and it's obviously completely full of people. These parking lots, I think they say each one of these is a 10,000 car parking lot. There were two bathhouses initially. I have no idea. This was back in 1934 that this was getting done. Each bathhouse had 10,000 lockers apiece. And so this area was clearly designed as just a massive beach facility for a huge urban center. He did not skimp. This is made out of an expensive sandstone imported from the Midwest. That nobody built public buildings, but he used a lot of disingenuous tactics here. So he would use a process called tent staking, where, say, this bathhouse I believe cost $3 or $4 million at the time, which was enormously expensive for the time. And he could not get appropriations for that much. He got an appropriation for $1 million and proceeded to simply build the foundation. But then he goes back to the legislature and say, well, it's not finished. We need $2 million more. But if you don't give that $2 million more, then you just wasted $1 million on a base with nothing. And so he serially and habitually would underestimate the cost of a project, get just enough funds to begin it, and then use that as a fait accompli to have the legislature or whoever else, bondholders, federal government later on, flip most of the bill. And so you could promise as low a price as it would take to get the project greenlit, and then say that they have to complete it or else they'll have wasted the sunk cost fallacy, so to speak. The other thing that he started to do is use these projects to gain power. Now, he was very savvy about not becoming wealthy himself, but when you're doing this and you're handing out the contracts, all of a sudden now the independent contractors that you pay, they want the work, right? They want the contracts. So they are now your allies, right? And if you want to go and say, well, one of the things I need you to do is there's a state representative in upstate New York, and he needs to vote for this. And so you need to give him a job or give his brother-in-law a job. And it's more than that, because the unions also had union workers. And so suddenly the union people would become in favor of this. And Jones Beach. So he transitions. He continues to do parks, and I'll do a map at the end that shows some of them. But then he started to say, well, parks and parkways, right? You can't just have a park. You have to have an access road. And so next thing you know, he is building 100-mile-long highways and starts to transition from just building parks, which he continued to do, and like playgrounds in New York City, to building arterial highways. And it got to the point, there were multiple bridges into Manhattan particularly, but he started to build more. And he started to armor himself with more power. So he started off as just the Parks Commissioner for Long Island. Then he gets appointed Parks Commissioner in addition to that to New York City. And then he goes into something called an authority. And if you've ever heard of the New York Authority, the New York Port Authority. So authorities are kind of a classic mercantilist invention, or if we wanted to use it in 20th century terms, a fascist invention. In England, which he was highly influenced from England because he went to Oxford, sometimes what you would have done is the government, the king, would go to somebody and say they needed a bridge or a ferry or some other infrastructure. And they'd say, okay, I will grant you monopoly for you to build whatever it was, whether it was a ferry, a dock, a bridge, a port, whatever it may be. And I will allow you to make a certain amount of profit, and then you will operate it, you'll make a profit, and then we'll have the facility that we need. In the United States, this was used a few times. There was already a New York Port Authority. He didn't create that. But the idea there was you would create this public-private partnership. They would take out bonds to build a bridge. And say, okay, we need to build a bridge. The bridge is going to cost $10 million. They will issue $10 million in bonds. The people who buy the bonds will then get the bonds payback plus interest, so you make a little profit. And then once the bridge will have tolls, we'll use the tolls to pay back the interest on the bonds. Once the bonds are paid off, the bridge will revert and become city property or state property or what be that, whoever was the issuing authority. And so you'd have these bridges that would be bridges or whatever else would be built for profit by these authorities, and then the authorities would cease to exist and the bridge would become part of the city. He found a loophole on this though, because basically he would, as long as the bonds were not paid back, the property would not revert back to the state or the city. And he could also go by the inviolability of contract and say, well, we're building a bridge and we're paying back the bonds. But then they would just take the collateral, because once you have a bridge that has tolls on it, it's already done, you can issue more bonds. And there's a formula for this. But if you have a bridge that's bringing in $10 million in tolls per year, you can probably get in $100 million in bonds from that bridge. And what can you do with $100 million in bonds? You can build another bridge, and then you can use the tolls on that to get even more bonds and build another bridge. And it got to the point into the 50s where he had about $2 billion or $3 billion worth of bonds and tolls on which to build construction, and the city itself had no money. Like the city itself had no money allocated for new construction. And because of his use of these authorities, and then the thing is the authorities would then have all these contracts to pay back the bonds. They keep getting more bonds, issuing more bonds, and having to pay them back. So they never reverted back. And so these authorities just became perpetual things. And the state could not abolish them without violating the contract to pay back the bonds. So he ends up establishing, there's a couple of these bridges. I think this is the Verrazano Narrows. Here he is. There's Manhattan. There's Long Island. This doesn't look like a photograph. This looks like a picture. But he ended up at one point holding about 12 different, at the same time, government jobs. As he branched out to power dams. So there's these giant dams up on the St. Lawrence River in upstate New York, the Messina Dam and the Robert Moses Dam that he built. He was building arterial highways all over New York City, across New York City, the tunnels, the bridges. At one point, every single bridge into Manhattan was a bridge that he not owned personally, but was through authorities that he was the chairperson of and controlled and could dispose. And then it went even deeper than that, because if you have a bridge, bridges are very safe, but they hypothetically could collapse. So bridges would pay insurance towards banks. They would buy insurance policies towards the eventuality of them collapsing. And these are great money makers for the banks or the insurance companies, because the likelihood that the bridge will actually collapse is close to zero in any given year. And so you're going to get the fees for the insurance, right? But you're never going to have to make a claim. And so insurance companies would beg to get the insurance on these various bridges. And he'd say, okay, he would pick the banks that he wanted, but then he would say, okay, but as a condition, blah, 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 you need to pull favors with this guy, with this congressperson, with this senator, with this whoever. And then on top of that, the bonds wanted to be bought by banks. So banks wanted to be bondholders, and they would beg for the right, because it's just easy money, right? It's like a sure thing. The bridge is going to have tolls. People are going to use the tolls. It's like an automatic thing. So his power really was so strong. And not to go back, but when L. Smith was governor and he was the commissioner of the Long Island Park Authority, he made an enemy of FDR. FDR was not the governor at the time. FDR was just in the administration. I think he ran the Taconic Parkway, and Robert Moses completely controlled the parks to such a extent that FDR couldn't do it. They hated each other, absolutely hated each other. FDR went on to be governor and then went on to be president. And then as president, he tried to oust Robert Moses completely unsuccessfully. So this guy was so ensconced politically had so many layers of defense, whether it be by his position as the head of the Triborough Authority, or the New York State Park Authority, or the head of the park department in the city of New York, or whatever else it was, that he could not be dislodged. And then he continued this policy of building roads everywhere. So the biography then, I'll leave you to see the book about all the details. There's so many projects that he did, and we'll cover a couple of them. He did the World's Fair, he did the United Nations building, and all these highways. So it's interesting, though, because I think highways are very similar to parks, where people are like, well, roads are good. What's the problem with roads? Well, the problem with roads is that they take up a lot of space. And so when he would build this road right here, if you look, it's just an interchange. This interchange probably eliminated and would force the move. If this had all been filled with apartments, which many of them were, this could have easily evicted thousands or even tens of thousands of people. These highways can completely destroy neighborhoods, and the book details that happening. Completely destroy neighborhoods. The other thing is that they're very inefficient at bringing people in. And so these bridges that he would build, they would reach capacity within 1 or 2 years. And no matter how many bridges they built, they just immediately became full. And it's a question of, like, if you build it, it will get used, and it will be so used that there will be no excess capacity. And that was just constantly happening. And he did not like public transit, perhaps because he didn't have the power to create that much of it. And so no new trains were built, no new subways were built. It was all roads, and roads can choke a city, and did choke and do choke New York City. Let's see. Yeah, so this is a map of New York City, and the green are parkways. So these are all the parkways that he built, and parks. You can see it's just completely full of parks. You can't even really see very well all the tiny ones. And then the housing, he did slum clearance for about a decade and evicted, they don't know for sure, but probably more than 500,000 people in about a 10-year period. He definitely seemed to target minorities, so that's the other thing. He was definitely racist. He did not like black people or Latinos. He made no apology for that. When they were building, let's say, things like swimming pools, he did not build any in Harlem. And when he got crap for this, he finally did build one on the edge of Harlem, but he had it so that the water was too cold to swim in, and then he decorated the interior with monkey statues. The other thing, if you look at these parkways, so here, if you can see this is Jones Beach. This is his first big park, this giant beach park. Still to this day, that picture I showed is from 2010, so I'm assuming it's still there. He did not want poor people to use this beach. He wanted this for middle-class people. And so he did not allow there to be any mass transit to this location. It's all only roads. And not only that, he didn't even want buses to be able to go here. Now, he knew that as long as he was in charge of the parks and the parkways, he could just say no buses are allowed. But he knew that at some point he would lose control of the parkways because he died or because he lost power. So what he did is these parkways, there's no stoplights or anything. So whenever they cross another road, usually that road will go over as a bridge. And I believe there's something like 110 bridges that this parkway to Jones Beach goes under. And he built every one of the bridges to be 11 feet high at the curb, which is too short for a bus to go under. A car can go under fine, but a bus or a truck cannot. So even if they changed the law and said we want to run buses here, they would have to have rebuilt every single bridge to allow that. So this is an example of using the physical infrastructure to gerrymander what you want. Let's see if there's any more. I think this is the last picture. So again, that's kind of a rough outline of the biography. And then it talks about how he lost power, and I won't give that away. It doesn't really matter. But the point here, he was in power for about 45 years, from 1932 or 1934 until 1968 or 69. And when he lost power, he then tried to regain it until he died in 1981, which the book came out before that. So the book ends before his death. So I think that what's really interesting here, though, is people always talk, well, who will build the roads? Well, this guy will build the roads, right? And the thing is, he has his vision, right? He was a visionary in the sense where he would look at a city and say, well, I think this is what should be here. But the thing is, that's his opinion, and there's no objective basis for his belief that a certain area should be a giant park or a giant highway or a bridge. And there were lots of examples where people would say, well, in this situation, a tunnel would be cheaper and better. And he's like, no, a bridge is better, because he just thought bridges looked cooler. And they satisfied his grandiose vision of himself as a builder more than a tunnel did. He ended up owning tunnels because his authority took over other authorities later in time, but he did not like to build them. But there isn't actually a way to do the calculus to say, well, tearing down this many slums or this many apartments and what was and wasn't a slum and what counted, is itself a debate for an arterial highway is not an easy question. In fact, there isn't a definite answer to that. And so you can say, well, who's going to build the roads? Well, this guy is, and he's going to build them all over the place and destroy half the city, which is what he did. And doom the city to an infrastructure nightmare that it can't escape from in any meaningful sense, even now, 50 years after he's been out of power. And there's also this illustration of the fact that, certain things people just emotionally think are good. Roads are good. Parks are good. So if someone's building parks, isn't that a good thing? Well, they talk about him building some of the parkways, and he would just destroy people's lives. He had farmers who were just making it go, and they would come and take half their field, and so they couldn't make it anymore. But then he would also occasionally take a rich person's estate and then say, well, look, I'm hurting, and you could see people say, well, all those rich people, fuck them. Yes, so he did fuck some rich people, but then he fucked hundreds of thousands of poor people, because they're much easier to fuck. Like the rich people they couldn't always stop him, but sometimes they could. Or sometimes they could make it worth his while to, they could bribe him through whatever means. And they had more means to defend themselves than somebody who was poor. And so poor people got evicted and ruined and destroyed and forced to relocate much more often than did wealthy people. But another interesting thing from Caro's point of view, so Caro's this big New Dealer, and in the Origins things that I read, he points out, like, well, he never got elected. Well, I would say, so what? If he had got elected, would that suddenly transform? Let's say he got elected and did everything exactly the same. Would that be okay then? There's this weird idea, this mythology about voting, that either it automatically makes it justified. Okay, so if he goes through a neighborhood of minority people and evicts all of them and then builds a playground, and you want to say that's horrible, that's evil, because this guy wasn't elected, okay, fair enough. Let's say he is elected and he does exactly the same thing. Do you now then say, oh, it's totally fine? Or do you say, well, since he's elected, he won't do that then? No. I think the problem with the New Deal, the problem with progressives, the problem with the people who see the state as some kind of infrastructure utility agent is that they don't have answers to this. They can't weigh the various values, the value of a piece of land as parkland or as tenement or as business or as factory or as railroad. They can't juggle that. Market can juggle that. It's not an easy thing, but the market can do that, because then you can see how much do people really value it, how much are they really willing to pay, versus what do you think? Because this is, and Caro admits, Moses is a genius. Moses is a brilliant guy, no question about it. But he has he's not omniscient, right? He doesn't know everything. So my eye is getting drawn here, this west side of Manhattan, this big green belt. This is an area that he just decided he wanted to build into a giant park. And there were people there were factories there were railroads there, but he just had a vision. He would go out on a boat across the Hudson River here and just think, this would be so much better if it was a park. And parks aren't necessarily bad, but they're not necessarily the best thing or the only thing, but that was just his vision, and then he had the political power to make it happen. And the fact that he was or wasn't elected, he did run for governor, by the way, in the 30s and lost. It's the only time he really ran for elective office. But yeah, I don't know. I think the people, if you believe in the state, if you believe in democracy especially, they don't really have a comeback to that. It's like, well, look at these horrible things that happen when you don't have democracy. It's like, okay. This guy was awarded, he didn't steal power with tanks, right? His positions were positions that the legislature voted on. So you're only adding 1 degree removed. That's still a legislative process. There's still voting going on. So, he didn't steal power in that sense. He was awarded power through a duly elected legislature, either from the city or from the state or both, or the federal government as it came to later when he started to control federal highway funds. So what do you say then? That it's bad, that it's okay because you got votes, or do you just assume, well, if you're getting votes, then you won't do bad things? No. The way elections run, the disconnect between what a voter wants or intends or hopes and what they're able to transmit through their ballot to the representative is infinitesimal, right? It's basically nothing. And the ability of the electee to interpret that to just give carte blanche to do whatever it is that they would want to do anyway is pretty much absolute. And the check, when they control the elections, when the opposition is coming from a similar elite group, you don't really have any control. And there's just all these questions about, and to Caro's credit, there's questions about how should we just build an infinite number of bridges? Should we not build railroads? Should we not build ferries? Should we not build tunnels? Well, the thing is, you don't know, Robert Caro, and neither does an elected official. Fiorello LaGuardia, the longtime mayor of New York City, he doesn't know. FDR doesn't know. Al Smith doesn't know. And the fact that they won an election does not grant them like magical powers. Like they won the election and like they have this surge of energy and like they now are possessed with the necessary wisdom and omniscience to do this. It's absolutely not true. It's actually kind of a weird. I mean, if you actually imagined it that way, it's obviously ridiculous. And yet, that's how most people talk about it. That's how most people envision it. Like this infusion of democratic spirit will enlighten them. No, absolutely not. And as pointed out, and I've read in some of the subsequent, like a lot of people still laud this guy because he had a sufficient power to enact his will, and because he had the funds to do it because of the bonds and because of the tolls, he was able to get stuff done. He was able to build stuff at a rate that the government normally can't because he was able to circumvent so many of the restrictions. And so many people now are like, well, isn't this great because he could build all these things? Yeah, if you assume that what he was building is good, right? If you assume not only, and it's not enough to say, well, somebody used the road, somebody used the park, therefore it's good. Yeah, there's an opportunity cost there because the thing that was built destroyed something that was already there, prevented something else from being built, and also cost a hell of a lot of money to be built and maintained on top of everything else. And so, again, people have this kind of metric by which they measure a public utility by saying, well, do people use it or not? If they built a road, look, if the roads are full of traffic, therefore it must have been justified. No, not necessarily. A lot of people go and look at the pyramids. That doesn't mean the pyramids were necessarily justified. In fact, I would argue that they're obviously not justified as giant tombs for dictators. To take half the surplus of the entire civilization just so that they can aggrandize their egos when they die. Yeah. But you could say it's a success because they look impressive and a lot of people are awe-inspired by them, right? Maybe not as obvious, but similar thing applies to just building roads and parks. And the types of roads and the types of parks. And you can criticize all day and say, well, I wouldn't have done it racist, and I would have done a different type of park, and I would have had a different philosophy of parks, and therefore it would have been, well, why is that philosophy correct versus everything else, right? There's no answer to this. So I think it's a fascinating book, and I think it's well worth reading. Caro's own biases, they shine through, and this is one thing that he did in the LBJ book. He's always at pains to defend FDR. In LBJ's book, he defends FDR from the likes of Coke Stevenson, who was a hardcore, basically libertarian, conservative Republican of Texas. And he does the same thing to defend FDR from Al Smith, who was a completely lauded, bona fide, progressive governor of New York City. And yet his esteem of FDR is so great that he can't help but defend them in the pages of the book, which doesn't really make sense in the context of the book. Why are we defending FDR? Right, the book is about Robert Moses and LBJ, but he just can't help himself. But he's asking a lot of pertinent questions. He just assumes that there's an answer through democracy. He just assumes that if elected officials had a stronger hand, then they would do the right thing. When not only does that, I mean, that's just a logical assumption, but based on what he already knows about what elected officials do and don't do, that's false. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have the best interest. They're corrupt. And they're also, when they're not corrupt, they just are not omniscient. They don't know what's best for everybody. And they can't juggle the various values that people have. How valuable is a park relative to how valuable is, cheaper food or cleaner water or better entertainment or whatever else. So this guy, Robert Moses, even though he's not their ideal, he really paints the picture, because this all could have been done by a governor. I mean, there are governors who had plans to do similar things, or by a mayor, or by a legislature. And if you look at the federal government, they build way beyond this scale. And when they do, it's not because they're more enlightened. They just have more power and more money. And so they can make it happen, and they can coat the entire country in fucking freeways or airports or army bases or whatever the case may be. So I found it a very gripping and enjoyable book. I learned a lot about New York City and how it was built and how it was organized. And I hope Caro finishes his LBJ book, but it's not Game of Thrones, that's history, so we know kind of what happened at the end. So anyway, I would highly recommend it. It's 1,300 pages long, but worth the read, or the audio if you do that. And next time somebody asks you who will build the roads, bring up Robert Moses and say he'll do it, and he'll kick out all the black people. So anyway, I want to thank you all for watching, and have a great night. Goodbye.